Okay, brilliant. So welcome everyone arriving to our third FIRE forum, the Accelerator for Innovation and Research Funding Experimentation at Rory. I am your host, Tom Stafford. FIRE is a project from Rory, the Research on Research Institute. Here's a slide showing our partners and our 9 brother and sister projects in Rory. FIRE exists to kind of create interest and awareness of the potential for better evidence in the funding system. We want to excite people about experiments. We want to support them to have the know-how to do experiments, and then we want to kind of work with people to run experiments. It's a partnership between Rory and the Innovation Growth Lab. The Innovation Growth Lab have some funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and they have a few opportunities coming up, which I'm going to show here. So we have the IGL Research Network, supporting people in the kind of, particularly in a kind of field of innovation, funding to do experiments. They have a call for seed grants to support pilots for innovative experimental ideas, which closes on January the 15th. And they have a handbook on experimentation in science commercialization and a launch event on January the 23rd, which you can sign up for. I will put the link in the chat at some point during this meeting. So with IGL, we've teamed up for this program, the FIRE program. It's got 3 strands. You're at the forum, where we seek to kind of create the space for conversation between funders about using and generating evidence on the funding system. We've got support, sprints, capacity building workshops, and then we want to kind of accelerate into running actual experiments. So here we are on the third and final forum of 2024. We've got more to come in 2025. Do sign up. It'd be lovely to have you there. And what we're hoping to do is, through the combination of bringing kind of people together in the forums, working with people in our sprints, our kind of focus sessions, we hope to launch a new round of experiments and announce them at MetaScience 2025 in London, where it would be great to see many of you there. I'm going to skip that slide. But for today, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Rachel Kendal, who holds a chair in the anthropology department at the University of Durham and studies, I think she describes it as kind of cultural transmission. And so I'm really excited to have her here today to transmit some of the learnings from her experience as a sort of one-time funder, distributing funding from the Templeton Foundation as part of the Cultural Evolution Society.
Yeah, so thanks ever so much, Tom, for the invite to speak in the Funders Forum. As Tom said, I'm going to talk about a one-time funding scheme that I've been privileged to run called the CES Transformation Fund. And I got to design and run this funding scheme thanks to the generosity of the John Templeton Foundation and on behalf of the Cultural Evolution Society. And I was president of that society at the time I proposed this grant scheme. So the project is rather ambitiously entitled Transforming the Field of Cultural Evolution and its Application to Global Human Futures. And I have to start by really saying I was really privileged to act as a funder, and also feel that I benefited hugely from being brand new to this. And consequently, I was facing no kind of institutional legacy, so I could literally make up how I wanted the funding process to work. And I didn't face any issues of, the logistics and the politics of changing embedded systems. So I think that's a caveat. I had carte blanche, essentially. That being said, I didn't do this alone, and I had a really great team behind me that I'd like to acknowledge. So Lorna Winship was wonderful project manager for this grant, and she's online and will hopefully be posting useful links in the chat as I go along. Also, Sarah Wright was a wonderful assistant manager, and Eleanor Miltiadis worked with us in the early stages of embedding EDI into our grant scheme. And our overall aim was to boost, strengthen, and extend the scientific discoveries of the field of cultural evolution. So here you can see an infographic we've been working on. It's not quite finished, but to achieve our overall aims, we explicitly wanted to tackle 4 diversity objectives, which were embedded into our process. And you can see them along the bottom line. So these were tackling early career obstacles by enhancing opportunities for early career researchers, tackling Western centrism in research by extending the geographical reach of who is funded to undertake cultural evolution research and where that research actually takes place. So beyond, we were thinking Northern America and Western Europe, but including Indigenous peoples from those regions. Our third objective was tackling traditional disciplinary divides. So we wanted to encourage new disciplines into the cultural evolution field and interdisciplinary approaches in projects. And finally, we wanted to tackle the division of scientists and public policy makers by encouraging the application of cultural evolution to current large societal issues that we're facing today. And as you can see from the infographic, where these 4 diversity objectives kind of feed into this tree on the infographic, we feel that they gave rise to 8 emergent themes across the applications to the different funding calls that were involved in our grant scheme. And it turned out that many of these kind of emergent themes echoed the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So I will talk more about our full process in a minute, but I just wanted to be clear about how we made funding decisions. So every application was scored and commented upon independently by 3 reviewers, and those reviewers never met each other. And the pool of reviewers was really quite large. So some individuals reviewed just 1 application and others reviewed many, and there was a whole scale of in between. The applications were then ranked by these reviewer scores using a Bayesian model that accounted for the fact that each application wasn't reviewed by the same panel of reviewers, and also accounted for disparities in how reviewers used the scoring scale. So some might use it in a more harsh way and some in a more generous way. We thank Richard McElrath for doing this for us, and his code is available on GitHub if you're interested, and hopefully Lorna will post that in the chat if she's able to. So when we had these uncertainty adjusted ranks, we used these to determine the top 25 applications. And then the final 20 that were funded were confirmed only after consideration of the reviewer comments for things like quality and feasibility concerns. And it was only at this point that I knew the identities of the applications at all. So my team kept everything anonymous from me, which is a huge relief when you're quite involved in the field. So it was a pretty competitive scheme. So we had 115 applications and we funded 17% of these across our funding calls. So we gave 16 awards across 4 different themes for 18-month research projects. And we gave 4 18-month awards for applied working groups. So these working groups ran workshops to implement cultural evolution with real impact on societal issues, so including non-academics in those workshops. And then in addition, we funded 3 shorter seed corn awards for those who just missed out on full funding. So our full funding process was heavily influenced by our motivation to embed equity, diversity, and inclusion. So if I keep using the acronym EDI, that's what I mean. If you're in the States, it's DEI, I believe. So just so we're all on the same page. So in summary, the things that we did to embed EDI, we had a 2-stage application process. So we had an outline application stage that was short, and it prioritised ideas over presentation. And if individuals were successful, they were invited to a full application stage. And that included mentoring opportunities for earlier career researchers, those who were new to the cultural evolution field, and those where reviewer comments highlighted that some advice on cutting-edge methods might be useful. We also implemented a confidential diversity box in the application form, which is where applicants could outline how their project and their team fulfilled the diversity objectives that we had, along with any other sensitive issues to do with personal disadvantages that they wished us to consider. So the grant team, excluding me, independently considered these diversity boxes in order to record where the grant scheme's diversity objectives were met by a project, and to ensure that groups with protected characteristics were not disadvantaged in any way. And so diversity was considered anonymously alongside the independent reviewer scores for applications that were close to the threshold for being invited to submit a full application or for funding. And so often individuals who were just below the threshold but had really high diversity scores were bumped into the funding threshold. We also had an ethics box where applicants were asked to engage with ethical questions regarding their projects. So this included disciplinary guidelines, but also things like fair treatment of their team members, participants, equitable collaborations, thinking about the communities in which they work in, open science, all of those kind of things. And the reviewers considered this explicitly in their assessment. So I think this really helped foster those EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion principles through the whole research process. We had very diverse reviewer panels. So each application was assessed by 3 reviewers that were as diverse as possible in terms of things like gender, geography, nationality, career stage, and discipline. And to maintain anonymity, review panels were different for applications at the outline stage and at the full application stage. So those who were successful in gaining funding had to actually get through 6 reviewers in total. We also employed a sequential anonymized, de-anonymized review process. So reviewers were asked to first score and comment on research proposals that were written anonymously, and only after scores for the anonymous section were submitted by the reviewer did the grant team then release the non-anonymous information about the team. And then the reviewers were able to score and comment on the suitability of the team to achieve the proposed research. But importantly, reviewers couldn't alter the scores for the anonymous proposal after realizing who the team were. And finally, we had a survey after the funding competition that was sent to all applicants, whether they were successful or not, and all reviewers to gain anonymous feedback regarding all of these different measures. So I'm going to focus the rest of the talk on providing more detail on the anonymized, de-anonymized review process. But before I do that, I just want to highlight the outcomes in relation to the EDI diversity objectives. Although obviously we had all of these different measures that we put in place, so we can't tie down the outcomes to any one of those. So data from the funded projects indicate that the CES Transformation Fund's EDI-related diversity objectives were fulfilled through our open competition that I think importantly didn't employ any kind of diversity-related eligibility criteria or pathways, and it didn't employ any quota system. So 50% of our awards are led by early career researchers as principal investigators or co-investigators, and 50% are led by Global South researchers, which reduces parachute research in the 50% of our awards that conduct their research in the Global South. So in other words, ensuring research is carried out with local populations rather than on the local populations by Western researchers. And the map that you can see highlights how the scheme is reducing Western centrism in whom is funded to undertake research in the cultural evolution field. So 78%, so that's 18 out of 23 awards, involved non-North American or Western European researchers. And on the map highlighted in blue, you can see there's 60% of awards that involve these individuals in those leadership roles, so PI or co-I, and indicated by the red outline around the country are the remainder of projects that involved other team members from those countries. So that's a brief summary of the outcomes. So I want to move now to focusing in on the sequential anonymised, de-anonymised review process. So just a little reminder that this involved an anonymous proposal that was reviewed, those scores were locked, then non-anonymous team details were given, scores were provided by the reviewer about how suitable the team was to produce the work proposed, and then both of those scores were combined. So as we know, selection processes often lead to discrimination against underrepresented groups, yet research indicates that reducing discrimination can make our institutions fairer and more equitable, and diversity in teams can contribute to producing much better outcomes for research. So the key benefits of this approach were that the proposal was reviewed blind, so it should reduce conscious and unconscious bias. But this second stage of releasing identifiable information meant that you could have independent consideration of aspects that were important to be considered in a non-anonymous way. And my feeling is that this anonymization process is possibly more effective in reducing bias in whom is funded than a model of like a randomization or lottery once passing a funding threshold. So although that model is undoubtedly useful, if it's used on its own without blind review before individuals reach that threshold, then they're still subject to unconscious or conscious bias. But that's open to discussion. That's just my thought, and I don't know how all this lottery stuff is run. But let's consider how the reviewers and the applicants involved actually evaluated this anonymisation, de-anonymisation process. So from our survey of reviewers, we had 212 reviewers involved and 63 responded. So 95% found the process straightforward and an appropriate time commitment. The two reviewers who thought the process wasn't straightforward or too time-consuming actually revealed reasons other than the sequential anonymisation process. And it was more to do with reviewing multiple applications or the applications being outside of their field. 93% found no problems with the proposal being anonymous, and they'd like to see the system used in more funding competitions. There's a handful of individuals who had some negative comments, and you can ask me about those. I do have a slide about that. And of the 33 that responded to an invitation to comment on anything particularly good or helpful about the grant scheme as a whole, 13 spontaneously praised the sequential anonymisation process. And by this, I mean that this question was asked of them really early on in the survey before any mention of the sequential anonymisation process or any specific questions about it. And just in general, several said that it was just really nice to review proposed ideas without having to worry about who had written those proposals. But I have a few more specific quotes to give you a flavour of what reviewers said. So we have one here. I thought that separating the identity of the research team from the evaluation of the project itself was helpful in assuring that I could review the quality of the project itself rather than the reputation of applicants. I found often that the highly prestigious applicants had turned in lower quality proposals, perhaps because they're used to being funded based on their name or their previous accomplishments. Another reviewer said the two-stage process of blinding the first half of the review was an interesting innovation and one that affected my review. After the authors were revealed, it changed my opinion of the proposal in a way that was unfair. Knowing the authors, it made me rethink some uncertainties I had about the proposal, giving them the benefit of the doubt, something I'd not have extended to less established authors. Not having the author information during the initial stage, I think made my review more fair than if I had the information through the full process. Other reviewers said the clever double-blind review solution was magnificent. That was lovely to hear. And I wish major funders would take note of this simple solution to a very important source of bias in the grant-getting process. I hope to see more of double-blind or 1.5 blind grant review. Another said the anonymity, which is a word I always struggle with, was great, even though it's a very small field, and I could have guessed at a few candidates. I genuinely had no idea who was involved in the application. Not revealing that until the end and not being able to change your answers based on that is genius. Why aren't all grants reviewed like that? So then I wanted to think about the responses of the applicants. So we do have survey responses from the outline applicants, but they were answering the survey sort of 10 months after they'd been through the process. Their results are broadly similar, but a little bit tinged with a lack of memory for the nitty-gritty, so I'm not reporting them. But basically, we had 25 full applicants respond to our survey, 16 were funded and 9 were not. So when asked the question, should sequential anonymised, de-anonymised review be used by funders, 18 said yes. So they said things like, I don't know why funders don't use such a system more, or it helps applicants believe in the system and the grant team. Then we had 1 maybe and 3 no's. 2 of those no's actually wanted everything to be anonymous, and 1 actually felt they'd been disadvantaged. So they said, I think we were treated like we did not know enough about the community we were researching and didn't have relevant expertise. And I think that that may have come from an assumption by the reviewer that we were a different group of people. This was corrected after the team was identified that at that point, the scores on the proposal had been given and were locked. So they felt they were disadvantaged. But I'm not sure how appropriate their assumption about what the reviewer thought is, whether it's correct. And you could always argue, well, if the proposal was written better, then the reviewer wouldn't have had these negative assumptions. But still, it is an issue that obviously some people will be worried about with anonymisation. So enough of sort of the praise we received for this process. There were some challenges, so logistically for the grant team, and the other major one that cropped up was maintaining anonymity in the anonymous part of the proposal. So the logistical issues, well, it requires funders to adapt their application forms or their portal to separate anonymous and identifiable parts of the application so that these can be sent sequentially to the reviewers. And we couldn't find any grant software that enabled this process, unfortunately, and we did search for quite a long time. And this is worrying because we all know that recruiting reviewers is difficult. So we don't want to create a system that's onerous for them or requires them to conduct their review in 2 stages that might be separated by them moving on to other tasks or even going to bed and having to wake up the next morning to receive the second part of the review. And this could result in incomplete reviews, which would be problematic. So we created a pretty laborious workaround where once the proposal scores were submitted, we manually assigned the identifiable team details part of the proposal to the reviewer. So this meant we had to monitor this continually, which not quite 24/7 because we did need to sleep, but we had a very international pool of reviewers, so they're in vastly different time zones. So we wanted to make it as seamless as possible that reviewers could really do both parts of the review in one sitting. So it was quite intense and obviously not really practical in the long term. So this process needs to be automated. And so after realizing this, we investigated possible solutions. On the small scale, we've created a guide on how to do this just using Power Automate in Microsoft 365, and it just uses applications of Forms, Outlook, and Excel. And we created a website with a guide, which you can ask me more about. And for larger funders, I assume this process would need embedding into grant software, but it could use a similar process as we've outlined in our Power Automate guide. But what about the challenge of maintaining anonymity? So from the reviewer perspective, the main critique in the free text invitation to tell us where we could improve, the main critiques were to do with enforcing anonymisation, because some people did reveal their identities in the anonymous proposal part. And even if they didn't reveal their identities, around half of the reviewers said that they had guessed the applicant ID of at least one of the applications they reviewed. So we could say we need to work harder to enforce anonymity in applicants' writing, or maybe we just need to accept that recognition may be unavoidable in small subfields, so we are quite a small field, or due to people mentioning their field sites or their study species. If that's a very unique aspect to someone's research, then it makes them identifiable. But if you employ really diverse panels, including non-specialists, then this issue does get reduced. From the applicant's perspective, we asked them, was it difficult for you to write the proposal anonymously? And 11 said no, but 13 said yes. So they did find it hard. And most felt that self-citing or describing their research system revealed their identity, but it was disadvantageous for them not to cite their own work and describe their research system. So just one quote here from a funded individual, and I've redacted the name of their study population because it would identify them. So if I describe the blank work that has previously been done that the current project is building on, it is likely that people will know it is me. But removing the blank context from the write-up would also put me at a disadvantage because the project would not be contextualized in a reasonable way. So yeah, this is truly, I think, something quite difficult to think through and work out quite how to write these anonymous proposals for applicants. So the grant team perspective on this. So we did find that applicants struggled to write anonymously, even if they were trying their best to. But because we had this outline application stage, we were able to spot this problem and at least give better advice for those who were submitting a full application. So the instructions we gave were things like, when referring to your proposed team, use their roles, not their names. So the PI or the postdoctoral research assistant, for example. And when writing the proposal, use impersonal language in your research proposal. So I gave an example using myself of, I should write, there are many social learning strategies, brackets, Kendal et al. 2018, and I shouldn't write, my research indicates there are many social learning strategies, and then cite myself. So this is still quite tricky to do just because of these issues to do with identifying your species or your study populations, but at least there are ways to write fluently without identifying yourself. But we could go further. We could vet the applications and send them back if they contain identifiable information, or we could reject them outright. But I think you'd need a lot longer time window for your review process if you were going to do that. Or you could employ some kind of redaction strategies where you redact names, either manually from proposals or using some automated process. So in summary and to conclude, so we employed quite a lot of equity, diversity and inclusion measures in our funding process. The most popular with reviewers and applicants by far was the sequential anonymization, de-anonymization process. But also applicants really loved the use of the diversity box to elevate applications that were at the borderline of funding thresholds. But we can't isolate the influence of one measure in our EDI outcomes. So for example, there seemed to be an effect of mentoring on a few projects who were elevated from scraping an invite to full application stage to being top scorers for funding. And also obviously some projects were elevated into full application invitation or into the funded projects above similar scored projects at the funding threshold because they had a greater diversity score. So we can't isolate the impact of the sequential anonymization, de-anonymization review process. But I think a case in point about the importance of that sequential review process is that when reviewers were asked if they had a problem with the scores being locked for the anonymous proposal part, once they'd received the team suitability part, one individual said they did. And the reason they didn't like it is quite enlightening. So they said they wanted to change the scores for one proposal because they were more confident once the team was revealed. And then for another, they wanted to lower the proposal scores because they were less confident the team could complete it. So I think this really highlights, even though this individual had obviously been exposed to all this EDI stuff that we've been throwing at them through this process, it highlights how the scoring of proposals can still be biased by knowledge of the writer of the proposal, or even indeed what institution they're based at. So this is a plug, I think, that we really need experimental tests of the EDI impacts of a sequential anonymization, de-anonymization process. But that kind of experimental test would need to address the challenges of automation because it was really laborious to do it by hand. And the issue of enabling or enforcing anonymization in the anonymous part of the application. And that's everything. Thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to your questions.